And I'm going to share my screen as well. And let me know if that's coming over as well.
Can see it.
Cool. All right, yeah, so as I was saying, today we'll just be going over the basics of Altium Designer, which is what we're looking at right now. So we'll start at the very beginning. So what is Altium Designer? Altium Designer is an electrical CAD software, which lets us design PCBs on the computer. Who can tell me what PCB stands for?
Printed circuit board.
Yep. So printed circuit board meaning it's printed by some sort of machine, and I guess it's shaped like a board, and there's a circuit on it. So printed circuit board, something like that. So well, just a tiny bit of background about why we make circuit boards, printed circuit boards. So back in the day, this is how they would make devices. I think this is like a stereo or something. And you can see if you zoom in, it's just like a bunch of resistors and capacitors and wires, and they're all just thrown in here and soldered together. So I'm sure you can imagine how long it would take to assemble one of these. So for mass production, it's just completely useless. Don't ask me who invented it, but it was sometime in the 60s or 70s, I think. But somebody came up with the printed circuit board, which is basically just, it takes the place of all these wires and all these hand soldered joints. So you make a circuit board with all the connections printed on there, and then you can just solder the components in instead of having to solder them all point to point individually. So it makes it much easier to mass produce stuff like this, much cheaper, much faster, much more efficient. So that's why they do it this way. Today, of course, the circuits are much more complicated than this. This, I think, was probably drawn by hand. That's how they did it back in the day. But nowadays, of course, we design it on the computer. And that is what Altium Designer is for. So, moving on from that. So this is the deliverable from Altium Designer, right, is a circuit board. And when you're finished with your design, it's not going to look like this. So all the parts will be missing when we actually get this board made by the manufacturer. So they'll send us just a blank board with no components soldered to it. And then we have to go and solder on these components manually. So yeah, Altium Designer just lets us design the bare PCB, which we will solder components onto afterwards. Okay. One last little bit of background. Who can tell me the difference between through-hole components and surface mount components?
Through-hole components go all the way through. Surface mounts just stay on the surface, on one surface.
Yep, exactly. So an example of a through-hole component is this white connector here. So as you can see, there's holes drilled in the board, and this component has pins which stick all the way through. So you'll solder it on the opposite side. And then all these little guys, this is a resistor here. These are surface mount components. So there's nothing on the opposite side of the board. There's just a pad on the top, and the component is soldered directly on here. The advantage of surface mount is, well, one advantage of surface mount is you can put components on both sides and they won't interfere with each other. I haven't done that too much here, but you can see there are some components over here on the opposite side of these guys, which would interfere if they were on the same side. The other advantage is it's just a smaller package, typically, so you can fit a lot more components in a smaller space. It's also easier for a machine to assemble these parts. How you do it in production, or at least for our small scale of production, is So instead of going and individually soldering all these components, what you do is you make a stencil which has holes for every component you want to solder, and then you put paste or white paste over the stencil so that you leave a little bit of solder paste. You can basically just think of it as solder that hasn't been melted yet on here, and then you can put the components on top of the solder paste and then stick the whole thing in the oven and solder all the components at once. It's a lot harder to do that with through-hole stuff, so that's why you see a lot more surface mount stuff these days. Moving on. So getting more into actually how we use Altium Designer. So there's two, not quite sure what to call it, realms or something. So you have the actual board here, which is the physical realization of what you're actually going to be sending out. But then you also have the schematic. So the schematics are just an easier way to see what's actually going on in the circuit. So like if you're just looking at this, you can look and say, oh, there's a wire here. It's probably really hard to see. Well, here, if I go into 2D mode, which we'll talk about in a sec, you can see all the connections here, but it's pretty impossible to know what's going on just by looking at this. The schematic makes that a lot easier. So you can see, oh, we have some capacitors here, which are wired in parallel. So you're going to be doing your circuit design work in the schematic editor, and then this will get moved over into the PCB editor where you'll end up making the actual PCB. One last little note before we get into it more. So there are two programs we can use with Altium. So there's Altium Designer, which is the desktop application here. So this only runs on Windows. It's pretty heavy, so you don't need a decent computer to run it, but if you have a decent computer, it'll be a lot smoother. It's the same with pretty much all CAD software. It's just, because it's rendering all this. And this is where you'll actually be doing design work. But there's a second way to use Altium, which is Altium 365, which is basically like the Google Drive of Altium. So I usually just go 365 to altium.com and then it should pop up. But here you can see all of the things that you've made in Altium Designer, assuming you've saved them to the cloud. So this project should be saved to the cloud, so I should be able to pull it up. Yep, so here's that same thing in the cloud storage. And this is much easier to run. This will run on any operating system, I'm pretty sure, just in any browser. Maybe not Safari. Safari's kind of weird. But it's much lighter, so it won't be sucking up all your computer memory. It'll work on a tablet as well, which is pretty nice. So this is really good if you don't need to do any design work, you just need to look at the designs. 365 is a great way to do that. Yep, and you should have all the same things. You have the schematics and the PCB over here. And it also has some cool features which are not quite as nice in Altium Designer. So like if I'm looking at this connection in the schematic and I want to see where it is in the PCB editor, I can click on it, and then if you go over to the PCB, it'll show you where it is physically, which is super nice. Yeah, anyway, getting a little ahead of myself there. Yeah, basics, 365, super nice for viewing, but Designer is where you'll actually be doing design work. You can't do any editing in 365. I I guess I can stop for questions real quick if anybody has any before I move on. Yeah, let me know. Give it a sec. Okay, guess there's no questions, which is great, so we can move on to actual Altium Designer stuff. So, if you're going to remember one thing from today, remember this. Remember the panels button. This is quite confusing, or it can be quite confusing, and it takes people a while to figure this out. So you'll see like you have different panels around the side here, like this is your projects panel. So this is where if I have multiple projects, you can go and click between them and see all the different boards you're making. So say I accidentally close this and it's gone. Always go to the panels button, which is down here in the bottom right. I'm not sure, it might be kind of small. Just the thing, furthest thing in the bottom right. Click on that and it'll show you all the different panels you have available. So I accidentally closed the projects panel. So if I go here and click on projects, it comes back. The one that likes to run away is the properties window. So just properties should usually be over here on the right. If it's missing, go down to the panels button and you can find it down there. Yeah, remember the panels button, very important. Second general thing, keyboard shortcuts. So there's a lot of different keyboard shortcuts in Altium, and it's very useful to know them, to learn them, because it will speed you up, make you 10 times faster probably. To learn keyboard shortcuts, it's pretty nice in Altium Designer. So can you guys like read the text, or is it way too small?
It's pretty small. It's kind of hard to read.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I have to work with that. So in case you can't read it, this is the tools panel. And if you probably can't see this, but the T is underlined. So you can either click the tools button to open up the tools menu, or since the T is underlined, you can do the same thing by pressing T, and it will give you the same window. So just look for the underlined letters, and then you can get to all these things just by pressing that underlined letter. And it goes levels deeper than that too. So like within the tools, you can see that for this one, we probably can't see, but the first thing here is design rule check, and the D is underlined. So if I press TD, then it's going to take me to the design rule check. So very useful, and that will help you speed you up a lot. Yeah, so don't forget keyboard shortcuts. Okay, moving on from there. So PCB design is all about getting your components in the right spot, both in the schematic editor and in the PCB editor. So on that note, every single component has two things. Here, let me just open one up real quick. At least two things. So those two things are a schematic symbol. So this is what you'll be using in the schematic editor. And then it also has a footprint, which is what you'll be using in the PCB editor. And these two are tied together. So for this LED, this is like a standard symbol for an LED. And if we look at this, so these black things are the pins, so this is how you'll connect it to other things in the circuit. And you'll see it has two pins, and maybe you can't read this, but it's pins 1 and 2. And then if we look at the footprint, then it also has pads 1 and 2. So that's how the schematic is tied to the PCB. So the components, they should always have the same number of pins as they have pads. And when you connect things to these pins in the schematic editor, you will eventually end up connecting things to the pad in the PCB editor. Don't worry if that was not making any sense whatsoever. It'll probably make more sense in a sec once I demonstrate. Yes. So every board is a project in Altium Designer. So each one of these here is a project. Each project usually should only have one PCB, but you can have a bunch of different schematics. This is just an organization thing. You could put all this on one giant schematic document, but it could get pretty large. So usually if it's a large project, you'll split it up into multiple. But all of these schematics will just get smushed together when you actually go to the PCB side. So to open a project, actually here, let me take one step back. So in the top right, if you're logged in and you have access to the Formula Racing workspace, you should see Formula Racing at UC Davis up here in the top right with a little cloud icon. So if you don't, you can usually just click on this top right button here, and sometimes you just need to click on Formula Racing at UC Davis. If that's not the case, then send me a message and we can figure it out. I guess I should also mention, if people want to crack open, if people have Altium Designer installed, it might be a good idea to open it up and try to follow along a little bit. But I'm going to post this as well, so if you want to do that later, that's totally okay. Yeah, anyway, so you should see Formula Racing at UC Davis over here. If not, you won't have access to our projects. Second little thing, so one more button to the right, there's a little like profile picture button. So Altium Designer is a paid software, so you need to have the license. So if you have access to the workspace, then you can go over here and click the licenses button after you click the profiles licenses. And then you should see a list of licenses here. And you should be able to, there should be one that's called Altium Designer with, I guess this one has 20 seats. Expires next year, that's the right one. So there's just a button that says use license. So you just click use license and then you'll be able to actually use Altium Designer. If you haven't done this, then it won't let you edit or anything. So yeah, if you do have a problem with that, you can also send me or John a message. Yeah, anyway, so if you see Formula Racing at UC Davis up here and you're using a license, then you're good to go. So if both of those are true, then you'll be able to look at projects and create new projects. So you can either do that from File and Open Project or New Project, or you can, in the projects window here where it says Formula Racing at UC Davis, or it will if you're signed in correctly, you can right click and go Open or Create. So if I hit Open, then there's a few different options over here. You probably want to open from the Formula Racing drive. So you should have a list of projects if you click on the Formula Racing button. Anyway though, I'm gonna start just by doing a little example project. Also, sorry if I'm just like chucking information at you guys. Do stop me if you have questions. In fact, I'm gonna stop for a sec and take questions if there are any.
So, do we already have access to the Formula Racing like license?
So you should have access if you've gone to the electrical channel and put your name and email in the thread.
Right.
I think I've added like everyone, basically everyone here. So you should be able to get Altium and be able to see the license and access it.
Okay. I think I'm having some trouble, but I can ask about that a little later.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, we can try to figure that out afterwards, I guess. If people want to stick around.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right. I guess I'll go on for now then. Let's see. So I'm gonna make a new project here. So I just right-clicked there and did create new project. And you'll see a bunch of options here. I'm just gonna leave it on default and give it a name like test project. It's a bad name. So it'll take a sec. But eventually you should see test project over here in the projects window. And then you'll see there's nothing in there right now. It's probably hard to read as well, but it says no documents added. So you're gonna start with a schematic document. So to add a schematic document, you just right click on the project and you'll see it says add new to project, add new schematic. And give that a sec as well. And then it'll give you this blank schematic here. Well, I guess I should. So if you right click and drag, you can pan around. And then it's control and scroll to zoom. Useful to remember. Okay, let me. So we have a blank schematic with nothing on it. We probably want something on it. We probably want a component on it. So I'm gonna start just by making like a little circuit with an LED of some sort. So there should be a components window over here, but it's missing. So where do I go? Panels. There it is, components. So the components window is where you go to to get components, for want of a better description. So it has a little search bar. And also it's important to know which, there might be multiple libraries. You don't want to be in simulation generic. I don't really know what that is. You probably just want to be in this one that says all, but it should be there by default, so you probably don't need to worry about that. So let me just search for some sort of LED. And you can, if you select one of these things, you can see what the part looks like down here. It'll show you a little preview of the schematic symbol and the PCB footprint. So you can drag it over into your schematic once it's what you want, or you can also, I think you can do right click place, but for now we'll just drag it over. So now you have a component in your schematic. You want to be able to place this somewhere nice. So if you just click it and drag it, you'll be able to move it around. And then if you press spacebar, you can rotate it by 90 degrees. So I'm going to do it like this because I want to. So I could just connect this to power, but if you just connect a power to LED, what happens?
You burn it out.
Yep, you burn it out. So what do I need to add?
A resistor.
Yep. So I'm going to go over, I'm just going to search resistor and see what comes up. Obviously, if you're actually designing a schematic, you probably want to be a little more careful about what components you're grabbing. but I'll just grab whatever. So there's a resistor. I just searched resistor and grabbed something. And so I'm going to line this up with the LED here. And so you can either just place them right on top of each other to connect them, or more importantly, know how to use the wire tool. So the wire tool is how you connect things together. So I want to connect these two together. So there is a button for it up here. This is the toolbar. But you should always use Control W for this, because you're going to be wiring a lot of stuff, most likely. So if you have to go click this button every time, it'll save you a lot of time just to learn Control W. If you're going to remember one shortcut, remember that one, Control W. So I'm going to do Control W, and you'll see, actually maybe you can't see, but it gave me a faint little crosshair here. And when I hover over this pin, it turns red. I don't know if it might be impossible to see that. But so if it's red, you know you're actually going to be making a connection here. So once it is red, I'm going to click, and then it'll be drawing a wire from there. So I'm going to click on the LED and then drag down and click on the resistor again. And so now I've just made this wire here. You can move around the wire afterwards. And you'll notice if you move the components, then the wire likes to stick to them. So if you need to move components and you want to get rid of the wire, you'll have to delete the wire. So you can just click on it so that it's highlighted and press delete, which works for anything. So yeah, I have connected my LED to my resistor using Control W. And then I need a power source and I need ground. So that's when you probably want to use the toolbar for. I don't know the shortcut. There probably is one though. So all of these little buttons, if you long press them, you'll get a larger option menu. So I'm going to put ground down here. So you see this little ground symbol. If I click that, it'll give me a ground port here. So I'm going to connect this to ground. And then I need power. So if you long press this ground port, you'll see a big menu. And I'm going to place down a 5-volt power source here. So now I have a whole circuit here powered off of 5 volts. It is important to know that this 5-volt power port is not magic. It doesn't just create 5 volts for you. You do need this 5 volts to come from somewhere. This just works like a wire to connect. So if I had a 5-volt source somewhere, I would put another one of these guys on the 5-volt source, and then these two would be connected together. I guess that's a good time to mention nets. So in Altium Designer, any sort of pins that are connected together are referred to as a net. So these two pins would be a net, and this net is called, if you click on a wire, you can see what the net is called. That's not that useful, but good to know. So if you just place down a wire, Altium Designer will automatically name this. You can change that name, which is useful to do if you have a big schematic and you want to know what all these connections are. So the net label tool, so this is the wire tool, this little blue squiggly lines. So if you long press that, then one of the options is net label, which will give you this little red text. So if I put this net label on there, then I can rename this net to like my net or something. And then if you look at this wire, it now is named my net. So you can also use net names to connect things together. So if I don't want to actually draw a wire between these two, I can just name them both mynet. And since they have the same name, they will be connected together. So in the schematic editor, you don't need to physically connect them. In the actual PCB editor, you will need to physically connect them because there's no magic. You know, the electrons don't care what they're named. You have to connect them together with metal. Yeah. So I now have some sort of circuit here. So now I need to move this from schematic to an actual physical PCB. So I don't have a PCB yet. I only added that schematic document. So you'll need to go up to your project again and right click on the project here and do add new to project PCB. And that will now give you a blank PCB. So before we get too deep into it, let me go back to the idea. So there's a few different ways you can look at the PCB. So this is two-dimensional mode. So this is where you'll want to be when you're making changes. But then there's also three-dimensional mode, which is nice for just looking how it's actually going to look physically. So if you hit 3 on the keyboard for 3D, then you'll have, right now it's not very exciting because there's not much on here. And so 2 for 2D mode, 3 for 3D mode. In 3D mode, it's kind of a funky scheme, but if you hold shift, you'll see this ball come up, and then right click, you can pan around. If you're not holding shift and you right click and drag, it's just going to do this. Pan it around. I guess this is panning and this would be rotating, right? And then same as in the schematic editor, if you hit control and scroll, then you can zoom. Yeah, 3D mode, 2D mode, very useful. So you can place things directly into the PCB document. So the components window is still here. So I can go and I can grab that same component and it will come in fine. And you can see we now have a component in here. You don't want to do it this way though. In fact, forget I even told you that. The only way you ever want to add things to the PCB document is go back to your schematic and you go up to the options up here and you hit design update PCB document. So what that's going to do is that's going to take all of this stuff that you made in the schematic and it's going to move it over into the PCB. So you can also use the shortcut for that. You can see the D is underlined, so I'm going to hit design, and then the U is underlined for update, so I can hit U. So DU will do the same thing. And you'll see it will pop up with changes that are going to happen. So you don't usually need to worry too much about this, but you can read through and see everything it's going to do. So it's going to add 2 components. It's going to add D question mark, which is this LED, and R question mark, which is this resistor, to the PCB document. And then it's going to add 3 nets, plus 5, which is the net up here, ground, which is the one down here, of course, and then my net, which is the one I named here. And then, so once you get this, you're going to need to hit execute. So it hasn't actually done anything yet. It's just showing you what it's going to do. So you have to hit execute. And as long as you have green check marks up here, that means that everything worked correctly. So if you don't have green check marks, something went wrong. Hopefully that's not the case, and hopefully everything went well. And since I have all green check marks, I'm good to go. I can close this window. And then you'll see I have my resistor and my LED. It's kind of a funky LED I've chosen here, but you can just go with it. And so now you'll notice we have the same connections as we had in here. So here, I'll just connect these together to show, but since they're named the same, they're connected. So what we should see is we should see one connection between the LED and the resistor, and then the resistor should be connected to ground on the other side, and the LED should be connected to 5 volts on the other side. So we don't actually see any connections yet because we have to make those, but we can see here on this resistor, one side is connected to ground, and then these two are named the same, so they're in the same net. And you'll see it has this little line drawn between them. So that's showing you that these two need to be connected together. These two need to be connected together to make it match the schematic. And then, of course, you have +5 here on the other side of the LED. So once you've moved all your components from the schematic editor to the PCB editor, now your job is to actually make these connections physically. Because right now these are not actually connected together. Altium is just telling you they need to be connected together by drawing this line. So right now these aren't actually on the PCB because the PCB is this black thing over here. So I'm going to move these over. And it's the same as with the schematic editor. You just click and drag, left click and drag, and you can hit spacebar to rotate by 90 degrees. So I'm going to put these over here. And so these lines will help tell you where you should probably put your components. Because if I were to do it like this, now I'm going to need to connect from here to here. But if I turn these around this way, now I only have to connect from here to here. And what I'm doing there is, if you hit Shift and then hover over, it'll highlight those connections, which makes it a little easier to see. Anyway, probably too much information as well. Like I was saying, so now we need to physically connect these together. So it's the same as in the schematic editor, Control W. So if you hit Control W, you're going to get a green crosshair this time. And if you click on the first pad, then it'll start drawing. So this is this is going to be a copper trace ultimately when you get the design back. So you're now making a copper trace. Start that over. So Control W, click on your starting pad and you'll start drawing. And then you can just go down and click on your next pad. So this was a pretty easy connection. You can, if you need to make a longer, more complicated trace, you can click multiple times. So like say I needed to go around in a circle for some reason, you can just keep clicking. And once you click on a pad, then it'll finish the trace. You'll notice that it won't let you connect things together that aren't supposed to be connected together. So if I try to draw a trace down here, it won't let me. It'll walk around it. So Altium Designer is making sure that you're not connecting together things you aren't supposed to be. But Altium Designer isn't a genius. You have to tell it what you shouldn't connect together. And the way you do that is, of course, in the schematic editor. So if you wanted to get together both sides of this resistor, you would connect them together in here. But now you don't have a resistor anymore, so you probably don't want to do that. But anyway, so yes, it will avoid pads that are in different nets. Yeah, just to clarify in terminology, so again, nets are the connections. Paths are each of these physical terminals of the device. to stop for questions real quick again. And then I have like one or two more things to talk about, and then we'll call it a day. But yeah, questions if anybody has them. Okie doke. Last little thing I want to talk about is layers. So back in the old days, they just had one layer boards. So all the components are on this side, and you can see there's only connections over here on this one side of the board. Nowadays they have anywhere from 2 to, gee, I don't even know what the upper end is, but I've seen at least like a 10 layer board before. The reason you want layers is, so you don't need layers for this board because you only have to connect one thing together. But if you have 1,000 components and you have wires that need to crisscross over each other, the layers will allow you to cross them over each other without them interfering, right? So it's so if I were to draw something on the top layer here, so the top layer is the physical top layer of the board here, which shows up in red. So now if I need to draw another connection this way, it's going to have to go around, right? So that's when layers come in handy. So the bottom layer shows up in blue, so this is physically on the other side of the board. So these connections, they can go right over the red connections because there's physical separation here. Maybe you can see kind of. I'm not sure if that's coming up. But anyway, so you can make connections on either side of the board. And the way you connect different layers to each other is with vias. So vias are just holes drilled into the PCB that are filled with copper. So this via connects the top layer to the bottom layer. So if you need to crisscross connections, then you'd use vias. So there's a shortcut for putting down a via, which is very useful. So if you're making a connection with Control W, if you press the number 2, then a via will come up, and you can put down that via there. And then if I push L, then I can switch which layer I'm on. So if I go to the blue layer and then press 2 again, then I can do something like that. And of course, this is unnecessary because I could just draw a red line here, but now I could make a red connection down the middle if I needed to, for some reason. So this board right now has 2 layers, just the top layer and the bottom layer. You can have more. Your layers will all show up down here in the bottom. So it's probably hard to read, but we have top layer and bottom layer. So these are copper layers. So these are actual metal, which is going to be deposited on the PCB for connecting together circuit components. There are also other layers, like, so this yellow stuff is silkscreen. So it's just text printed onto the board. So this particular one is telling you what component this is, which is very useful when you need to figure out what in this schematic corresponds to what in here. Yeah. I guess that's the basics of Altium Designer. I can take questions, but that's all I wanted to talk about. Alright, cool.